Have you ever loved someone so completely that you would have given them your last breath, only to discover they saw you as nothing more than a stepping stone to their dreams? This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the person who breaks you the most gives you the greatest gift of all, the gift of knowing your own worth. When Daniel first walked into my life, I thought I was witnessing a miracle, not because he was particularly handsome, though his dark eyes held a warmth that made my heart skip. Not because he was wealthy or successful, because he was neither. It was because of the way he looked at me like I was the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered into the darkness. I was 28 then, working as a junior editor at a small publishing house in downtown Chicago. My life was predictable, safe, and achingly lonely. I had convinced myself that I was content with my small apartment, my cat named Hemingway, and my Friday night ritual of wine and manuscript reviews. I told myself that love was for other people, the kind who knew how to laugh without thinking about it first. Then Daniel appeared at the coffee shop where I spent my lunch breaks, looking lost and holding a crumpled piece of paper with an address scribbled in fading ink. He had just arrived from Romania, he told me, his accent thick and endearing. He was looking for the immigration office, but his English was broken, and the city was overwhelming. Something about his vulnerability called to every nurturing instinct I had buried under years of careful self-protection. When he asked if I could help him find his way, I did not hesitate. I walked him 6 blocks out of my way, pointing out landmarks and explaining the bus system. When we reached the building, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "In my country, people, they are not so kind to strangers. You have beautiful heart." That was the moment I fell. Not for his words, but for the raw honesty in his voice. The way he looked at me as if I had performed some miraculous act of kindness, instead of simply being decent. He asked for my number, and I gave it to him without the usual mental gymnastics I performed before letting anyone into my carefully constructed world. When he called that evening, his voice was nervous but determined. "I know I am new here and I do not have much," he said. "But would you maybe like to have dinner? I cook very good Romanian food. My grandmother, she teach me before she die." The crack in his voice when he mentioned his grandmother made my chest tight. I said yes. That first dinner in his tiny studio apartment changed everything. He had spent the entire day preparing, he told me, going to 3 different stores to find the right ingredients. The food was incredible, but it was the way he watched my face as I ate, the way he lit up when I complimented his cooking, that made me realize I was in dangerous territory. He told me about his life in Romania, about the poverty that had driven him to leave everything behind, about his mother who worked 3 jobs to support his younger sister, about the dreams he had of bringing them to America once he got settled. His eyes filled with tears as he spoke, and I found myself reaching across the table to take his hand. "You are the first person who really listened to me since I come here," he said. "Most people, they see me and they think I am just another immigrant looking for handout. But you see me." I squeezed his hand, feeling something shift inside my chest. "I see you," I whispered. Over the following weeks, Daniel became the center of my universe. He would text me good morning messages that made my heart race. He would show up at my office with little gifts, a single flower, a pastry from a Romanian bakery, a book of poetry he had found at a used bookstore because he remembered me mentioning I loved poetry. "You are too good to me," I would tell him, and he would shake his head with such conviction that I believed him. "No," he would say. "You deserve everything beautiful in this world. I just wish I could give it to you." The way he looked at me made me feel like I was glowing from the inside out. He would trace my face with his fingertips and tell me I was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. When I laughed, he would stop whatever he was doing and just stare at me with wonder. "What?" I would ask, self-conscious under his intense gaze. "I love your laugh," he would say. "It sounds like music." In Romania we have saying, "The heart that loves is always young." You make my heart young again. I had never experienced anything like the way Daniel loved me. He was passionate, intense, completely devoted. He wanted to know everything about me, my childhood, my dreams, my fears, my favorite color, the songs that made me cry. He listened to my stories with an attention that made me feel like the most fascinating person alive. When I told him about my father leaving when I was 12, about how it had made me afraid to trust completely, he held me while I cried and whispered against my hair, "I will never leave you. I promise you this with my life." When I shared my dream of writing a novel someday, he spent hours talking with me about plot ideas and characters. He would bring me journals and pens, encouraging me to write down my thoughts. "You have so much beauty inside you," he would say. "The world needs to see it." 3 months into our relationship, I was completely, utterly, hopelessly in love. Daniel was everything I had never dared to hope for: attentive, romantic, devoted. He made me feel like the heroine of my own love story. But love, I was learning, could be a dangerous thing when it was built on a foundation of lies. The first crack in my perfect fairy tale came when I offered to help Daniel with his immigration paperwork. I was not an expert, but I had researched everything I could find about the process. I wanted to help him achieve his dreams of permanent residency. "You would do that for me?" he asked, his eyes filling with tears. "You would help me stay in this country?" "Of course," I said, confused by the intensity of his reaction. "I want you to be happy. I want you to build the life you came here for." That night, he made love to me with a desperation that left me breathless and slightly unsettled. Afterward, as we lay tangled in my sheets, he whispered into the darkness, "I love you so much. You are my everything. My salvation." The word salvation stuck with me, though I could not articulate why it felt wrong. 6 months into our relationship, Daniel's visa was set to expire. He was panicking, talking about having to return to Romania, about losing everything he had worked for. I watched him pace my apartment, his hands shaking as he talked about the hopelessness of his situation. "There has to be something we can do," I said, my heart breaking for him. "There has to be a way." He stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I could not read. "There is one way," he said quietly, "but I would never ask you to do such a thing." "What way?" "If we were married," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, "I could apply for permanent residency, but I would never ask you to sacrifice yourself for me. It would not be fair." The room went quiet except for the sound of my heart hammering against my ribs. Marriage. The word hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn. "What if I wanted to?" I asked. His eyes widened. "You would do that? You would marry me?" "Daniel," I said, moving closer to him, "I love you. I want to spend my life with you anyway. The timing does not matter." He swept me into his arms, spinning me around my tiny living room, tears streaming down his face. "You are an angel," he said over and over. "You are my angel." We got married 3 months later in a small ceremony at City Hall. I wore a simple white dress I had found at a vintage shop, and Daniel wore a suit he had borrowed from a friend. We could not afford a big wedding, but I did not care. All I wanted was to be his wife, to build a life together. The immigration paperwork was overwhelming, but I threw myself into it with determination. I hired a lawyer, paying the $1,500 fee from my savings account. I gathered every document required, organized everything into neat files, and accompanied Daniel to every appointment. During the interviews, I held his hand and answered questions about our relationship with absolute honesty. Yes, we lived together. Yes, we shared finances. Yes, we planned to have children someday. Yes, this was a real marriage based on love. The immigration officer looked skeptical, but I met his gaze steadily. This was real. What Daniel and I had was real. While we waited for the green card to be processed, I supported us both. Daniel was struggling to find work, his accent and lack of American experience making it difficult for him to get hired. I did not mind. I picked up freelance editing projects, worked extra hours, and stretched my budget to cover our expenses. "I feel terrible that you are doing everything," Daniel would say, looking ashamed. "We are a team," I would remind him. "This is what people do when they love each other." I helped him practice for job interviews, coaching him on American workplace culture, and helping him improve his English. I taught him to drive, sitting patiently in the passenger seat while he learned to navigate Chicago traffic. I celebrated every small victory with him, and comforted him through every rejection. During this time, Daniel seemed to grow distant. He was stressed about work, he said. Worried about being a burden. I understood. The pressure of starting over in a new country had to be overwhelming. But sometimes I would catch him looking at me with an expression I could not identify. Not love, exactly. Something cooler. More calculating. When I asked if everything was okay, he would flash his charming smile and pull me into his arms. Everything is perfect, he would say. You are perfect. The day the green card arrived in the mail, I was at work. I came home to find Daniel sitting at our kitchen table, the envelope open in front of him. The card gleaming in the afternoon sunlight streaming through our window. It came, he said, his voice strange and flat. Oh my God, I screamed, dropping my purse and rushing to him. Daniel, it came. You did it. We did it. I threw my arms around him, but his body was rigid. He did not hug me back. Daniel, I said, pulling back to look at his face. What is wrong? This is what we have been waiting for. He looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood freeze. It was not joy or relief or gratitude. It was pity. I am sorry, he said. Sorry for what? For this. For all of it. He gestured vaguely at the card, at me, at our life together. I never meant for it to go this far. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process his words. What are you talking about? I am leaving, he said simply. Tonight. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. Leaving? What do you mean leaving? Where are you going? It does not matter where. He stood up, and I saw that there were already suitcases by the door. Packed. Ready. This was always temporary. Temporary. The word came out as a whisper. Our marriage? Our life together. I needed the green card, he said, his voice matter of fact. You were willing to help me get it. It was a transaction. A transaction? My voice was rising now, hysteria creeping in. Daniel, I love you. We are married. We built a life together. How can you call it a transaction? Because that is what it was. He would not look at me. I am sorry you thought it was something else. Something else. I was shouting now, my vision blurring with tears. I thought it was love. I thought you loved me. I never said I loved you. The lie hit me like a physical blow. I actually staggered backward. You told me you loved me every day. You said I was your everything. You said you would never leave me. I said what you needed to hear. The casual cruelty of his words cut deeper than any scream or argument could have. He had calculated every declaration of love, every tender moment, every promise. He had studied me like a textbook, and given me exactly what I needed to help him get what he wanted. There is someone else, he continued, his voice clinical. There always has been. She is American. She does not need to marry me for a green card. American, I repeated numbly. How long? The whole time. The whole time. While he was telling me I was his salvation, he had been going home to someone else. While I was working extra hours to support us, he had been planning his exit. While I was falling deeper in love with him every day, he had been counting down the days until he could leave. Why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why did you have to make me love you? You could have just asked for help. I would have helped you anyway. No, he said, finally looking at me. You would not have. You are too careful. Too suspicious. I had to make you trust me completely. He had studied me. He had seen my walls, my fears, my desperate need to be loved, and he had weaponized all of it against me. I thought I was your fresh start, I whispered. You were my paperwork, he said. He left that night, taking his suitcases and leaving behind only the keys to our apartment and a forwarding address for his mail. I sat on our couch, my couch now, staring at the green card he had left on the table like a tip. I did not cry that first night. I was too shocked, too empty. I sat in the dark until morning, replaying every moment of our relationship, looking for signs I had missed. They were all there, glaring in hindsight. The way he had never talked about a future beyond getting his green card. The way he had never introduced me to any friends from his home country. The way he had always been vague about his past. The crying came later, when I realized that the man I had loved with every fiber of my being had never existed. Daniel had been a character, a role he had played to perfection. The real Daniel was someone I had never met. I called in sick to work for a week. I could not bear to face the world, to pretend that my life had not just imploded. I barely ate, barely slept. I replayed our entire relationship obsessively, trying to find some moment of genuine connection, some proof that not all of it had been a lie. The worst part was not the heartbreak, though that was devastating. The worst part was the humiliation. I had been so careful with my heart for so long, and the one time I had let my guard down completely, I had been played by a master manipulator. I was not just heartbroken. I was ashamed. Ashamed of my naivety, my desperation, my willingness to believe that someone could love me that completely. I felt like a fool, and I could not shake the feeling that everyone who knew me could see it written across my face. When I finally dragged myself back to work, I discovered that Daniel had already been busy rewriting history. Mutual friends told me he had been saying I was too clingy and emotionally unstable. He was painting himself as the victim of a desperate woman who had trapped him in a marriage he never wanted. The gaslighting was almost as painful as the abandonment. Not only had he used me and discarded me, but he was now making me the villain in his story. The woman who had supported him, loved him, sacrificed for him was now being portrayed as the crazy ex-wife who could not let go. I wanted to scream the truth from the rooftops, but who would believe me? I had no proof that our marriage had been real to me and fake to him. I had no evidence of his lies. It was my word against his, and he was a skilled liar. For months, I lived in a haze of grief and rage. I would wake up every morning hoping it had all been a nightmare, only to remember that it was real. The man I had loved was gone, and he had never existed in the first place. I tried dating, but every man I met felt like a pale imitation of what I had thought I had with Daniel. How could I trust anyone again when I had been so completely fooled? How could I believe any declaration of love when I had learned that love could be so expertly faked? I was drowning in my own bitterness, and I knew I had to do something before it consumed me entirely. That was when I started writing. At first, it was just for me, a way to process what had happened, to make sense of the confusion and pain. I wrote about the early days of our relationship, about the way he had made me feel like the most important person in the world. I wrote about the red flags I had ignored, the moments when my intuition had whispered warnings I had not wanted to hear. I wrote about the immigration interviews, about how proud I had been to stand beside him and declare our love to strangers. I wrote about the long nights when I had held him as he cried about missing his family, not knowing he was crying for someone else entirely. I wrote about the day he left, about the clinical way he had dismantled our life together. I wrote about the weeks that followed, about learning to sleep alone in a bed that had been ours, about coming home to an apartment that echoed with the ghosts of false promises. Writing became my lifeline. Every page was a small victory, a way of reclaiming my story from the man who had tried to erase my voice. I wrote with a fury that surprised me, pouring all my rage and heartbreak onto the page. As I wrote, I began to see patterns I had missed before. The way Daniel had isolated me from my friends, claiming he wanted me all to himself. The way he had made me feel guilty for questioning anything he said. The way he had used my own insecurities against me, making me feel like I was lucky to have him. I realized that what had happened to me was not just heartbreak. It was abuse. Emotional, psychological abuse designed to make me compliant and grateful. Daniel had not just used me for a green card. He had systematically destroyed my sense of self-worth to make me easier to manipulate. The more I wrote, the angrier I became. Not just at Daniel, but at myself for allowing it to happen. I had been so desperate to be loved that I had ignored every warning sign, every red flag, every moment when my gut told me something was wrong. But anger, I discovered, could be a powerful fuel. It burned away the shame and self-doubt, leaving behind something harder and more determined. I was not going to let Daniel win. I was not going to let him reduce me to a footnote in his immigration story. I was going to tell the truth. The memoir began as a series of essays, each one focusing on a different aspect of my experience. I wrote about love bombing, about how predators use overwhelming affection to bypass their victims' defenses. I wrote about gaslighting, about how skilled manipulators can make their victims question their own reality. I wrote about the specific challenges of immigration fraud, about how criminals exploit the kindness of American citizens who want to help. I wrote about the signs to watch for, the red flags that I had ignored, the questions I should have asked. Most importantly, I wrote about recovery, about learning to trust my own instincts again, about building a life that was mine and mine alone. I wrote about the slow, painful process of rebuilding my self-worth from the ground up. I called the book Chapter 1, The Lie That God Approved. I did not use Daniel's real name. I called him Marcus in the book, but I did not shy away from the details of what he had done. I wrote about his manipulation techniques, his lies, his calculated cruelty. I wrote about the girlfriend he had kept secret, about how she had been in the picture the entire time. I wrote about the friends who had known and said nothing, about the community that had protected him while I fell apart. I wrote about the legal system that had failed me, about how difficult it is to prove immigration fraud after the fact. I wrote about the emotional toll of being used and discarded, about the way it had changed my relationship with love and trust. But I also wrote about survival, about the strength I had found in the depths of my despair, about the way writing had saved me from drowning in my own bitterness. I wrote about the other women I had met who had been through similar experiences, about the community of survivors who had helped me heal. I wrote about the importance of speaking out, of refusing to be silenced by shame or fear. I wrote about the power of telling your own story, of refusing to let someone else define your narrative. When I finished the book, I sat in my apartment holding the printed manuscript, hardly believing what I had accomplished. It was 300 pages of raw, honest, unflinching truth. It was my pain transformed into something useful, something that might help other women avoid what I had been through. I did not expect it to be published. I submitted it to a few agents, mostly as a formality, but I was not holding my breath. The book was too raw, too specific, too angry. Who would want to read about one woman's spectacular romantic failure? But the book found its audience. First with an agent who called it brutally honest and absolutely necessary. Then with a publisher who saw its potential to start important conversations about immigration fraud and emotional abuse. The book was published 18 months after Daniel had walked out of my life. By then, I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. I had learned to trust my instincts again, to value my own worth, to demand respect in all my relationships. I had also learned that my story was not unique. In the months following publication, I received hundreds of messages from women who had been through similar experiences. Women who had been used for green cards, for money, for citizenship, for access to their social circles. Women who had been love-bombed and discarded, who had been made to feel crazy for questioning obvious lies. The book became a bestseller, but more importantly, it became a catalyst for change. Immigration lawyers began using it as a resource for clients who suspected they were being used. Therapists recommended it to patients struggling with the aftermath of emotional abuse. Support groups formed around the country for survivors of immigration fraud. I started getting invitations to speak at conferences, to appear on podcasts, to write articles about the warning signs of immigration fraud. I became an accidental expert on a topic I had never wanted to know anything about. But the real vindication came 2 years after publication, when I received a call from a Netflix producer who had read the book and wanted to adapt it for television. "Your story reads like a thriller," she told me. "The way you uncover the truth, the way you rebuild your life. It is incredibly compelling. We want to turn it into a limited series." I almost said no. The thought of putting my most painful experiences on screen, of having actors portray the worst period of my life, felt too raw. But then I thought about all the women who had reached out to me, who had found strength in my story. If a television adaptation could reach even more people, if it could prevent even one woman from going through what I had been through, then it was worth it. The series, titled Chapter 1, premiered 6 months ago. I worked closely with the writers to ensure accuracy, to make sure the portrayal of emotional abuse and immigration fraud was responsible and educational. I wanted viewers to understand not just what had happened to me, but how it had happened, why I had been vulnerable to Daniel's manipulation. The actress who plays me, Sarah, is brilliant. She captures not just my pain but my strength, my journey from victim to survivor. The actor who plays Daniel, Marcus in the series, is equally skilled, showing the calculated nature of his manipulation without making him sympathetic. The series has been a massive success, sparking conversations about immigration fraud, emotional abuse, and the importance of trusting your instincts. It has been nominated for several awards, but more importantly, it has reached millions of viewers who might never have picked up my book. Last week, I received the message I had been waiting for without realizing it. A friend sent me a photo taken at a coffee shop downtown. In it, Daniel sits hunched over a laptop, his face pale and strained. On the screen is the opening scene of Chapter 1. The scene where Marcus sweeps Sarah off her feet with his charming vulnerability. Daniel was watching himself be exposed to the world. He was seeing his manipulation techniques dissected and analyzed. He was witnessing the woman he had discarded become a best-selling author, a television producer, a voice for survivors everywhere. The photo was taken by someone who recognized him from the series. The caption read, "Spotted the real-life Marcus watching himself get dragged on Netflix. The irony is delicious." I stared at that photo for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, yes. A sense of justice finally being served. But there was also something deeper, something more profound. I had spent so long feeling like a victim, like someone who had been used and discarded. But looking at that photo, I realized the truth. I had never been the victim in this story. I had been the hero. Daniel had thought he was using me, but in reality, I had been gathering material for the most important work of my life. Every lie he told me, every manipulation he employed, every cruel word he spoke, all of it had become part of a story that would help countless other women. He had thought I was just a means to an end, a way to get his green card. But I had been the main character all along. I had been the one with the power to shape the narrative, to decide how the story would end. The series has been renewed for a second season, focusing on my journey of recovery and the community of survivors I found along the way. The book has been optioned for a feature film. I have been asked to write a follow-up memoir about the aftermath of publication, about what it means to transform trauma into art. But perhaps the most satisfying part of all of this is the knowledge that Daniel has to live with what he did. Not just the knowledge that he hurt me, but the knowledge that his actions have been immortalized in a way that will outlast both of us. Every time someone watches the series, they see his manipulation techniques exposed. Every time someone reads the book, they learn to recognize the warning signs he embodied. Every time someone shares their own story of immigration fraud, they reference the template he provided. He wanted to use me and disappear, to leave me broken and forgotten while he built a life with someone else. Instead, he gave me the greatest gift of my life, a story worth telling. I am not the same woman who fell in love with a charming stranger at a coffee shop. I am stronger now, wiser, more careful with my heart. I have learned to trust my instincts, to value my own worth, to demand honesty in all my relationships. I have also learned that sometimes the person who hurts you the most gives you exactly what you need to become who you are meant to be. Daniel broke my heart, but in doing so, he broke me open to possibilities I had never imagined. I am a best-selling author now, a television producer, a voice for survivors, a woman who has turned her pain into purpose, her trauma into triumph. And Daniel is just a footnote in my success story, a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, but simply refusing to let someone else's cruelty define your worth. The woman he thought was too naive to see through his lies became the woman who exposed those lies to the world. The woman he thought was too weak to survive his abandonment became the woman who built an empire on the foundation of her own resilience. He thought he was the protagonist of his own immigration story, with me as a minor supporting character. But stories have a way of revealing their true heroes, and in this story, I was always the one who mattered. Chapter 1 was just the beginning. The real story, my story, is just getting started. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of survival, resilience, and triumph over adversity. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives that remind us all of the strength we carry within us.